What if the pain he caused you wasn't about you at all? Not your voice, not your softness, not your needs, not your timing, not your past. What if the silence, the withdrawal, the way he shrinks you with a sigh or a stare, had nothing to do with your worth, and everything to do with the war he refuses to fight inside himself? You keep trying to decode the moment it all shifted. You replay the warmth that turned cold, the closeness that now feels like a performance, the I love you followed by emotional exile. You wonder if you asked for too much, if maybe you misread things, if your hurt is just a flaw you were supposed to hide better. But let me tell you something only women who have loved deeply and been hurt silently understand. It was never about you being too much. It was about him being unequipped, unwilling, and too afraid to meet you where you live. Deeply, honestly, emotionally. And once you realize that, everything starts to change. The truth most people won't say out loud is this: men don't always hurt you out of cruelty. Sometimes they hurt you out of cowardice, out of avoidance, out of the terror they feel when they are finally seen. When a woman shows up fully, emotionally available, intuitive, and brave enough to love deeply, it unearths something in a man who has spent his life avoiding himself. Not every man wants to go where love asks him to go. Into presence, into honesty, into accountability. So instead, he disappears. Not always physically. Sometimes it's worse than that. He's in the room, but unreachable. He hears your voice, but doesn't respond. You cry, and he turns away. Not because he doesn't hear, but because he doesn't want to feel what your pain awakens in him. He pulls back, not because you're wrong, but because your truth is too honest, too clean, too real. And realness terrifies a man who has lived his life behind emotional armor. And so he does what emotionally avoidant men do. He criticizes, he retreats, he withholds. He makes you feel like your emotions are too much or your questions are starting a fight. But what's actually happening is this: you are exposing his inadequacy, not by attacking him, just by being whole in a place he only knows how to show up in pieces. Let's be clear about something. Control doesn't always look like yelling or rules. Sometimes it looks like care. I just don't want you to get hurt. I think you're overthinking it. Why do you always assume the worst? These phrases aren't shouted, they're whispered. And when whispered enough times, you start to believe them. You begin to doubt your gut. You apologize for your feelings. You abandon your own intuition and call it love. But what it really is emotional shrinking. It starts slow. You stop bringing things up because he's tired. You hold back your truth because you don't want to ruin the moment. You make excuses for his distance. He's just going through something. And little by little, the vibrant, intuitive, courageous woman you were starts to dim. You shrink not because you're weak, but because you're trying to survive a relationship that asks you to trade your truth for temporary peace. And that peace, it's not peace. It's compliance. There's a reason this hurts so deeply. Not because you're fragile, but because you are emotionally present in a relationship with someone who is emotionally absent. He may tell you he loves you, but love without access isn't love. Love without listening isn't love. Love that punishes your vulnerability isn't love. It's control disguised as affection. You may notice how he withdraws when you speak up, how he becomes cold when you express a need, how you end up saying, "Never mind, it's not a big deal," just to keep things calm. That's not harmony. That's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. Here's what makes this so confusing. He's not always bad. There are moments of sweetness, memories you hold on to because they prove he can connect. He's not cruel. He doesn't yell. He may even apologize sometimes. But what keeps you stuck isn't what he does. It's what he doesn't do. He doesn't fight for your heart. He doesn't sit in the discomfort of your emotions. He doesn't rise into the man you keep believing he could become if only he would try. And so you stay. Because he's not that bad. Because no relationship is perfect. Because you've invested years. But underneath all that reasoning, there's a quiet ache. A slow bleed. A loneliness you don't talk about, not even with your closest friends. Because how do you explain the feeling of being unseen by someone who swears they love you? Let me speak directly to that place in you. It's not your fault he can't meet you. It's not because you're unlovable, or too intense, or too sensitive. You're not too much. You're just finally enough to expose what he's been avoiding. And rather than meet you in truth, he chooses silence. Because silence is easier than change. Distance is easier than growth. And control, disguised as concern, disguised as calm, is easier than emotional responsibility. You see, some men don't want to control you. They want to control how close you get to the parts of them they cannot bear to face. Your emotional presence threatens his internal chaos. Your honesty threatens his avoidance. Your longing for intimacy feels to him like a demand, not a desire. Because to meet you emotionally, he would have to meet himself first. And that's a mirror many men aren't ready to look into. And so he blames. He blames your tone. He blames your timing. He blames your emotions. But he never blames his inability to stay, to engage, to actually hold space without shutting down. Because if he admitted that, if he saw himself clearly, he'd have to change. And some people would rather lose love than lose control. And here's the trap. He doesn't hit you. He doesn't cheat. He doesn't scream or threaten. He just disappears. Mid-conversation, mid-feeling, mid-connection. He leaves the room, or he leaves the moment, but he always leaves you holding the weight of the disconnection. And that absence, it becomes your problem to solve. You adjust, you explain, you apologize for how you said it. You take the blame not because it's yours, but because someone has to hold the relationship together. And he's already walked out emotionally. That's the quiet erosion no one warns you about. Not bruises on your skin, but slow bruising of your soul. He tells you it's not that serious, that you're making a big deal out of nothing, that you're always looking for something to be upset about. And so you start second-guessing yourself. You silence your instincts. You begin to believe that the pain you feel is just your own flaw showing up again. But let me say this clearly. If you constantly feel unheard, unseen, and unimportant in your relationship, something is not wrong with your heart. Something is wrong with the dynamic. And emotional neglect is abuse. Just because it's quiet doesn't mean it isn't violent. Just because he doesn't raise his voice doesn't mean he isn't breaking you down. Many of the women I've worked with over the years say the same thing. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I used to be strong. I used to feel like I had clarity. That's what happens when you spend too long in a relationship where you're asked to perform peace instead of live in truth, where you tiptoe instead of speak, where you read his moods like weather patterns, where your emotional reality is constantly debated, minimized, or ignored. That's not intimacy. That's adaptation. You have become so good at managing him that you've forgotten how to care for yourself. And here's the most insidious part. When you start to pull away, when you begin to express your exhaustion, he suddenly becomes attentive. He listens, he agrees, he apologizes, he doesn't want to lose you, but he still doesn't want to change. So you stay, hopeful again. He said the right words this time. He looked like he meant it, but days pass, weeks, and the distance returns, the subtle digs, the cold detachment, the intimacy drought, the emotional unpredictability, and you begin to question yourself again. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I just need to be more patient. No, you don't need to be more patient. You need to be honest with yourself. Let's talk about guilt, because it's the most effective tool men like this use. They don't scream. They guilt you. They say things like, I do everything for you. You never appreciate what I give. You always twist my words. I'm trying my best, and you still aren't happy. And suddenly, you're on trial. Not for what you did, but for how your feelings make him feel. And so what do? You fold. You explain. You walk back your truth. You choose connection over clarity because the idea of being too much terrifies you. But here's what I want you to remember. If guilt is the price of love, it's not love, it's control. And guilt will keep you trapped far longer than fear ever will. Now let's talk about control, because it rarely looks like domination. It looks like protection. He says he knows better. He wants what's best for you. He tells you how your friends influence you, or how your emotions distort your memory. And over time, you stop trusting your own perception. Not because you've become weak, but because you've been systematically trained to second-guess your own reality. And here's how that shows up. You stop wearing what you love because he makes subtle comments. You cancel plans with girlfriends because it makes him feel left out. You stop speaking your truth because every time you do, you feel punished with withdrawal, coldness, or the look. You know the look. It says, "You've disappointed me," and you've internalized that look like a warning sign. So now your nervous system doesn't respond to kindness, it responds to disapproval. And that is the cost of control. You lose your voice. You lose your clarity. You lose your sense of self. But here's the cruel twist. The better you love him, the more invisible you become. Because he's not actually looking for love. He's looking for someone to validate his avoidance. He doesn't want a partner. He wants a container, a place to hide from his own emotional responsibility. And you, your empathy, your emotional literacy, your loyalty, make you the perfect place to disappear inside. But you are not a hiding place. You are not a home for someone else's silence. You are not a receptacle for someone else's wounds they refuse to heal. And if this is resonating, I want you to ask yourself something with brutal honesty. What have I been calling love that is actually emotional survival? You can't fix him by becoming smaller. You can't earn love by erasing your needs. And you can't save a man who keeps using your kindness to avoid doing the work he refuses to face. Yes, he may have a difficult past. Yes, he may carry wounds. But his pain is not your prison. The minute you start taking responsibility for his emotional patterns, you're not helping him. You're abandoning you. And abandonment of self is the wound so many women carry long after the man is gone. Not because he broke you, but because you broke your own truth to hold on to him. Let me pause here and remind you, you are not crazy, you are not needy, you are not hard to love. You are simply waking up to the fact that what you've been surviving was never love to begin with. It was a dynamic built on your silence, a connection maintained by your guilt, a relationship preserved by your constant self-abandonment. And now, because you're finally listening to your own voice, you're starting to see the cracks in the foundation. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. There comes a moment, and maybe this is yours, when the ache becomes louder than the hope, when the excuses you've told yourself start to sound foreign, when his silence doesn't feel confusing anymore, it feels familiar. Too familiar. That's the moment, not of breaking down, but of breaking open. You sit in the quiet not because you're finally at peace, but because your body is done begging for what your soul was never given. And that stillness, that's where it starts. The awakening. You don't rage. You don't scream. You just stop pretending. You stop pretending you're okay with crumbs. You stop pretending your intuition is lying. You stop pretending that his inability to show up is something you can fix. And in that decision, not loud, not public, not performative, you begin to remember who you were before the gaslighting, before the guilt, before the gentle conditioning that taught you to trade your voice for connection. You remember how it felt to speak without shrinking, to trust your instincts without running them through his emotional filter, to feel joy that wasn't dependent on his moods. And when that memory stirs, something ancient rises in you. You can't heal in the room that hurt you. You can try. God knows you have. You've rewritten yourself 1,000 times, trying to be more gentle, more patient, more understanding. But healing doesn't happen through self-erasure. It happens through truth. And the truth is this: peace that costs your voice isn't peace. It's a quiet kind of self-betrayal. You don't need to explain why your body tenses around him. You don't need to justify why your heart feels numb when he says, "I love you." You don't need permission to want something deeper, clearer, safer. You've spent enough time apologizing for needs that were never excessive. You've carried the emotional labor of two people and called it loyalty. But now you begin to lay that weight down. And here's what no one tells you. Leaving doesn't always mean walking out the door. Sometimes it means reclaiming the parts of you that left long ago. The girl who stopped singing. The woman who stopped asking. The truth that stopped being spoken because it was never heard. You don't need to burn the house down. You just need to stop setting yourself on fire to keep it warm. That's the shift. Not rage, not revenge, but return. A sacred return to self. You begin to move differently. You stop initiating conversations that never go anywhere. You stop explaining pain that keeps getting dismissed. You stop hoping he'll evolve into the man he showed you in the beginning. Because now you understand, that version was a performance. This version is the pattern. And the pattern doesn't change because you love harder. It only changes when you choose you. When you decide that you will no longer be the soft place for someone who uses your softness as an escape. When you realize that your empathy must now be turned inward, that the care you keep giving him is the care you are always starving for. This is not about blame. It's about boundaries. This is not about punishing him. It's about protecting you. You don't need to demonize him to walk away. You don't need to diagnose him to let go. You just need to tell yourself the truth. You deserve more than fragments, more than emotional crumbs, more than someone who only sees your value when you're gone. Your healing won't be loud. It'll be steady. It'll be you walking down the street with your head up, not because everything's perfect, but because you finally stop betraying yourself. It'll be you setting a boundary and not shrinking afterward. It'll be silence that feels like sanctuary, not punishment. It'll be laughter that returns unexpectedly, your own laughter. And it won't be because someone gave it to you. It'll be because you stopped waiting and started remembering. You were never too sensitive. You were sensing the truth. You were never asking for too much. You were asking for what was sacred: honesty, presence, safety. This isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. The quiet kind, the holy kind, the kind that happens when a woman finally stops abandoning herself to be chosen. You are not crazy. You are not hard to love. You are simply done calling emotional neglect a relationship. And that is your rising, not in defiance, but in remembrance. Of the woman you were before you were taught to shrink, of the voice you buried beneath his comfort, of the clarity that was never lost, only silenced. So let this be the line you draw. Let this be the day you choose you. Not in anger, but in reverence. Because your heart is not a battlefield, and your soul is not a sacrifice. If this spoke to something quiet and true inside you, share it. Don't keep your voice in the shadows anymore. Tell your story. Drop a comment, because your voice might be the lifeline someone else has been waiting for. You're not alone. You're just getting started.